So let's bring you this now. Prisoners convicted of serious crimes will have to submit DNA samples during their time in prison or before release. And that's if the Criminal Law Amendment Bill is actually passed. It's hoped that this will actually enable police to link suspects to cold cases and further identify repeat offenders. However, the Police Portfolio Committee is questioning the police's ability to collect and process the samples. But to discuss this even further, we're now joined by Vanessa Lynch from DNA for Africa. Quite an important conversation to have this morning. Vanessa, good morning to you and thank you so much for your time. I think let's start here. The current capacity of the SAPS to process and even collect DNA, where does it stand in your opinion?
I'm not sure of the current numbers. On the 1st of March, the DNA Oversight Board will present those numbers to the Portfolio Committee. But I do know that they have made significant inroads into the backlog. They have given a zero backlog day for 1st of November this year, but that doesn't include the numbers that are still being received. They have, however, fulfilled all the contracts that enable the Forensic Science Laboratory to, in fact, function. So I think they've made good progress in that regard. But obviously, there's going to be more of a burden once this bill is passed. I have heard that they're looking into public-private partnerships in order to help them with the capacity. So if you think about a DNA sample as a reference sample, which is a simple buccal sample, it's quite an easy process. It's not a complicated process, and it can be done by private laboratories if they have the correct procedures in place. And hopefully this is something that will be followed through, because we're going to need that additional capacity, because we can't allow this population not to be on the DNA database. It's a very important criminal population to include.
Absolutely. We've heard from the Police Portfolio Committee already casting doubts on the SAPS ability to collect mandatory DNA samples. In your view, do you think the bill is a move in the right direction, collecting that DNA sample from prisoners just to track cold cases and see if they're also repeat offenders?
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. We've seen significant, when they were able to, in the first 2 years of the DNA Act, when they were able to collect DNA from convicted offenders, there were some prisoners who were linked to over 30 cases of rape. You release, and that's just when they are in there for a common assault. When you release those prisoners, and we have serial offenders in South Africa, they will go back to raping. We've seen that too. So it's absolutely vital to get this population onto the DNA database. And it can be done on a piecemeal basis. It could be done that they only get sampled when they're released, so it's not a huge initial burden on the forensic science laboratories. But throughout the world, this has shown often it's the very first population that's put on the DNA database due to the fact that a lot of these prisoners do reoffend. So the Portfolio Committee were in fact very encouraged around the bill. They didn't, when I listened to the Portfolio Committee this week, they were just asking the question, how are they going to how are they going to actually sample them with the burden that they already have? But they were very encouraged by the fact this bill has been put before them, and I think they've given the 1st of April, hopefully, that it will be passed.
When we speak about the work that lies ahead for labs at this stage, I mean, what do you foresee the work that lies ahead of them, also for those critical vacancies to be filled, also in management? What is your view on that? Because they have a lot of work to do, especially if we're looking at these private partnerships or the public-private partnerships that, of course, even the President had made mention of.
Yes, well, I think there are a lot of laboratories in South Africa that can easily do this. PCR testing that we see for COVID is a pretty similar process, and they can reconfigure their laboratories to do reference sampling for DNA profiles with the correct consumables. They're building a new laboratory in the Eastern Cape, which I believe will be ready by the end of next year, and that will give them a significant amount of capacity. They have fulfilled a number of, all of their contracts and their maintenance contracts in the forensic science laboratories in Cape Town and Pretoria, because the government have now given them funding. Previously, they weren't given funding to fulfill the contracts. So they're doing everything that they can possibly do. But in order to increase the capacity, they will need to follow through with those public-private partnerships. Even university laboratories could contribute. So pressure needs to be put on to the government. I think civil society should continue their pressure. There are far too many cases that are outstanding and being dropped where people will be convicted if DNA was presented in court. So
and that's exactly what I wanted to ask you. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned that point, Vanessa, because for survivors who are also watching and listening in our conversation, I'm sure they're thinking, does this guarantee successful prosecutions, this new way we're going with, particularly this bill? Does it?
You know, DNA is not the silver bullet. You need all forms of evidence in order to prosecute a it is one of the most valuable forms of evidence that we have available to us. And specifically with regards to rape, there's no better evidence to convict a person. So that's why prosecutors really rely heavily on it, because they know that people often plead guilty.
Yeah.
So we need to ensure that we're using the best evidence possible in a society where gender-based violence is rife. So it is something we have to keep pushing for and give survivors the justice they deserve, which we're not currently doing.
Absolutely. Well, I appreciate your time this morning talking to us about this very important issue. Vanessa Lynch there from DNA for Africa, talking, of course, about the sampling that is, of course, expected to be conducted with prisoners already in prison, so to track them to any cold cases or even to find out if they are indeed repeat offenders.